Um, I just checked before we got started whether I was able to hear you, if there were to be any questions that were going to be asked, and that seemed to work fine. About asking questions in general, perhaps we left the impression, or I left the impression last week when we had that small discussion about asking questions during the lecture, because it took a bit long back then, right? Because I couldn't hear the questions at the beginning of the lecture, so they were all piled together somewhere in the middle of the lecture. I just want to stress, feel free to ask any questions, right? That's why we're here. That's why we're doing these lectures online in the first place, because it can be more interactive and we can respond to each other, and perhaps we're better able to tailor our lecture towards your needs. So feel free to ask questions, and if I or Sharon thinks that the questions aren't appropriate for that place in the specific lecture, then of course we'll let you know. We can always get back to that during the break. So that's what I wanted to point out in the first place. Oh, you can't see me, of course. Hi, in terms of interaction. Still getting used to this. A second question that came up is whether there is a need for a Q&A session. So before we get started, just to summarize the rest of your schedule for the coming week. So you have this lecture today, then you need to complete another weekly assignment about the topics of this week. There will be a final lecture on Tuesday about different forms of pseudo-reasoning and how to recognize them and better understand them. And then basically we have the exam on Friday, I believe, right? So it's on Friday. And perhaps that's enough, but perhaps some of you would like to have an additional meeting in Zoom where you can ask any additional questions that you would like to ask about the lectures, the tutorials, the PAs, the WAs, whatever you'd like. So we could have a Q&A session on Wednesday or Thursday. I still need to discuss it with Sharon, what works for him. But my question to you is whether you would be interested in going to such a Q&A session if we were to do it, because in my memory, interest in those type of sessions is somewhat limited, but perhaps because we're doing online teaching, there's a bigger need for being able to ask questions. I'm getting a lot of yeses. So what we can do is, if you go to the, so at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, it says participants. And if you click that, you should be able to see a row of participants. At least that's what I'm seeing. And there you can, as Claire did, indicate with either yes or no whether you want to attend a Q&A. I'll give you time to consider, just to gauge your interest in such a meeting. I'm getting 43 yeses so far, 44, one go faster, which then changed back to a yes, I presume. I don't know why the go faster and go slower buttons are there. I think it would confuse me if you were to use me like a cassette deck and fast forward me while I'm talking. But I think the yes, no buttons are interesting to be sure. All right, so I would call that an overwhelming majority. It's still just half of you have responded. So could the people who haven't responded yet please click either yes or no in the participant screen? All right, so I see where this is going. Thanks for voting. So I'm going to plan a Q&A session. I'm assuming your preference would be for Wednesday over Thursday, because then there would be more time between that and the exam. But yeah, I'll have to check with Sharon whether he'll be able to attend and when he'll be able to do so. I think Wednesday would work fine for me, but I'll have to check with him. All right. Thanks for giving this input. There's also a poll function in Zoom, but I wasn't able to find it in this session. All right, without further ado, let's move on to the actual topic for today. We're going to talk about argument reconstruction and assessment, which is basically a lot of the topics we've been talking about so far, but we're going to focus on a couple of details which are relevant in both reconstruction, and I'm going to give you some additional tips that are useful when you need to assess an argument that has already been reconstructed. What's useful to know is also that this is a disclaimer for the rest of this lecture, is that, and especially for the chapter in the book, chapter 5, which is quite extensive in the amount of detail and the length of the examples they cover in the book. And that's because that's the most useful thing that you could potentially learn, right? That you can apply these skills when you're reading a newspaper article or a scientific publication or whatever, a tweet by a friend. So it has a potential broad application, but of course we're not able to test all those applications during an exam as you're used to here. So the examples I'm going to test you on during the exam will be relatively simple if you compare it to the examples used in the book in chapter 5, and especially compared to the examples in chapter 6, which are can be quite extensive. So the stuff I will have you reconstructing in the exam, the arguments will contain a couple of lines. And usually what I do is that I already provide the standard form in which you have to plug in the propositions, right? So to keep that, to put some boundaries on how extensive your reconstruction can become. I'll show you an example after at the end of the lecture. But that's just as a disclaimer. So we're going to talk about some examples and how we can use that in different applications. And if you feel overwhelmed by the different techniques and especially the examples in the book, be reassured that the way we test this in the exam is with relatively straightforward examples, which should look kind of like the examples I'm using in this lecture. All right, let's go. We're first going to talk about argument reconstruction, what to look out for, and how to look out for that. And we're going to talk about argument assessment. First of all, I want to show you a silly video, which is about the Babel fish. And the Babel fish supposedly proves that God doesn't exist. It's a silly example, but my question to you is, and you can see it here, right? Why should we conclude that God doesn't exist?
Because any proof that he exists would deny faith, and without faith, he is nothing, so he would not exist.
Exactly. Because we can prove that God exists, we have actually proven that he doesn't exist, which is a, well, interesting way of proving something. But there's more to the argument, right? We've just talked about one aspect of the argument, because you can also focus on why can we prove that God exists. And if you were to reconstruct this argument, and you probably wouldn't be tempted to because you're watching a movie or reading a book and you're not thinking, hey, let's reconstruct what they're saying as an argument and see what happens. But that's my hobby, right? Everyone needs a hobby, and this is mine. So I did it for you, and this is what it would look like. So we have an extended argument here. Let me make it somewhat bigger. And I put this, I've tried to make the structure of the argument explicit by showing you this diagram. And what this shows is that it contains, well, two separate arguments actually. One is about why we have proved that God exists. That leads to the conclusion, the interim conclusion that God exists. And the other one is what we just discussed, right? So that leads to the interim conclusion that God doesn't exist if we have proof instead of faith. That faith and proof are, they deny each other. So let's look at that left part of the argument, because that's very interesting. If evolution by natural selection is correct, the Babel fish would be very likely to exist. Either the Babel fish is the result of natural selection, or it is proof that God exists. Therefore, given that the Babel fish exists, we can conclude that there's proof that God exists. Which sounds like a weird argument, and you're all thinking probably, why are you talking about the Babel fish? Because this is ridiculous. But bear with me, because this type of argument, the structure of the argument, is actually very common in discussions about intelligent design. That's the left part of the argument. The right part is what we talked about. Proof denies faith. Without faith, God is nothing. If God's existence can be proven, then God doesn't exist. And those two interim conclusions, the conclusion that there is proof that God exists, and the conclusion that if its existence can be proven, then he doesn't exist, or she doesn't exist. There's proof that God exists. If God's existence can be proven, then God doesn't exist, so God doesn't exist. So that's the structure of the argument. This is quite an extensive argument, right? It contains two sub-arguments, if you will, that lead to two sub-conclusions, which lead to the final conclusion of the argument. And there's some interesting stuff happening here that we're going to talk about in this lecture. Not specifically related to the Babelfish, but some of the steps I just took in Fast Forward is what we're going to do in argument reconstruction as well. I tried to put what was said in the video or what you could read in the excerpt from the book into simple if-then statements or into disjunctions. So if this happens, then that happens. Either this thing is the case or that thing is the case. So I try to describe the given text in terms of those simple operators or clear logical operators, which is a form of logical streamlining as it's described in the book. What I didn't do is make all uses of vague language clear, which leads to different problems. And we're going to talk during this lecture how we can deal with vague language and how we can deal with ambiguous language. Because what does it actually mean to say that God is nothing? Does it mean that he doesn't exist? Or does it mean something else? That's a very vague phrase, right? And we have to deal with that in our reconstructions. I skipped over it here because I don't want to get entangled into interpretations of what this specific phrase means, but it is something we need to deal with if we're analyzing other arguments. We also made, or what I also did, was made interim conclusions explicit. So I've indicated that different sets of assumptions lead to interim conclusions, would lead to the final conclusion, which is also something that you need to do when reconstructing arguments. All right, so for those of you who thought it was pure silliness, let me point out the following, that during my studies I read a book by Michael Behe, and which I found very interesting. What he does in the book is describes gaps in the theory of evolution. So stuff we can't explain using the theory of evolution, like having a blood clotting mechanism. And what he points out is that if you were to evolve a blood clotting mechanism as an organism over multiple generations, then let's say you need 10 steps to have a complete mechanism, and all the interim steps, 1 through 9, would be lethal for the organism. So his point is that a blood clotting mechanism is too complex to have evolved in an organism using a regular evolutionary process. So he says it must have been designed. Basically, this is an argument that you're going to encounter a lot, and the structure of the argument even returns in a different form in errors that people make when reasoning about p-values. So that's why I stressed it. It's ridiculous in the Babelfish example, but you will recognize this form of reasoning when you are arguing with a creationist or somebody who believes in intelligent design, because he was able to show that there's some stuff about the human body, for example, physiology, that we don't understand yet in evolutionary terms, or when we're talking about p-values and drawing conclusions about the how likely the null hypothesis is. All right, for now you can forget it. What I try to show is that you can go through all these different steps with an example that you might encounter in a silly movie or in a book, and I try to show you that if you try to get to the core of the argument by showing its structure, then you need to go to different steps that we're going to focus on in this lecture.